They had an interesting courtship from the standpoint that my dad is either 13 or 16 years older than my mother. Um, he pretty much grew up in Montana, Idaho, up in that area. Was an outdoorsman. Um, Mother grew up in Salt Lake, so she was pretty much a city girl. She was infatuated with the movie stars and movie business. Um, she met her best friend when they were in, I think, high school. Vera, I can't remember what Vera's maiden name was. She married Ed Schellenberger, and he went by Ed Shell. And they were my folks' best friends, and we did most things together. The Shells had 4 daughters. When the Shells were in town, we pretty much spent the weekends with them and went to many, many places. A lot of the resort places in the Intermountain area. We went to the canyons east of Salt Lake. They primarily used the picnic tables after meals to play cards on. I'm not sure I ever really learned how to fish, but I did go fishing with my father. We'd go to Bear Lake almost every summer with the Shells and other people. And some people fish there, but my dad and I never went fishing there. We primarily played on the beach and swam in the lake there. My sister's name is Beverly, and she was born 4 years after I'd been born. She had coal black hair, so she was called a papoose since she looked like the Indian children there. I know I was almost always in trouble with my dad because I didn't treat my sister the way he felt I should treat any girl, but especially my sister. But being 4 years difference in age, we didn't have much in common, like playing and things like that. I was very skillful with my hands. I built model airplanes from as young as I can remember until I was in high school. The elementary school was called Jefferson. The classes that I preferred were the math and science classes. I hated English. Thought that was a stupid subject to have to take classes in and learn the grammar and read all those stupid stories you had to read and then write a report on them. I was a good student, and I was in the top 3 in the class. There was another boy and a girl that I would compete with, and we were all probably about the the same capability. Some sections of our neighborhood that had some kids that liked to bully others. I could find routes that I could bypass that area where they were. And some of the neighbors would pay me to cut their lawns. So that was essentially my first job, and I don't remember how much I got. A lot of the people in the neighborhood were fastidious about their lawn. So that was a good experience to learn to do a good job and to take pride in my work. During the summertime, we had a professional baseball team. My mother's aunt and uncle lived close to the ballpark. They made money during the ball season by parking cars on their yard because they had some empty lots. I would stand on the edge of the road and yell, "Park your car here, park your car here," and I would wave my arm, and then when it would get dark, I had a flashlight, and I'd stand out there and wave them into the parking lots. But with the money I made there on Saturday mornings, I would get up early, and I would go up for the Saturday kids movies. And I think paid maybe 10 cents to go in, and it was noisy. I don't remember seeing many adults, but I don't see how adults could have stood it. Kids were running around screaming and hollering. And I think even at times some of the kids fell out of the balcony and got hurt because there was so much running around. The movies were great because it would start out with cartoons, and then there would be a serial that would come on, and couldn't wait for that serial because it would always end at a very precarious point, so you're left hanging till the next week. Generally, when we got out, the merchants in town would donate things like dairies and bakeries. So we'd get like a cupcake or a Twinkie, or sometimes I remember when Pepsi-Cola came out, they had sky riders that would write Pepsi in the sky. And as we came out of the movie at that period of time, we all got a bottle of Pepsi. That was pretty good. We'd get orange juice or milk or other things that the local merchants would have there for the kids when we got out of the movie. So that was a Saturday ritual, was to go up there and go to the movie. There were a couple of the boys in the neighborhood that I played with a lot of the times. But my mother's youngest brother was maybe 1 to 2 years older than me. He was able to have a bicycle. My dad wouldn't let me have a bicycle. He felt it was too dangerous. So I rode double on the bike with my Uncle We went everywhere. There wasn't a place we didn't go. So that sure fouled up my dad's thoughts of keeping me safe, because that was a lot more unsafe than anything else, riding double on a bicycle, particularly uptown where there's streetcar tracks. Get your tires in that groove there, you can't maneuver. There were 3 high schools: South, East, which was where the wealthy people lived, and West, which is where the poorer people lived. It was the first time I liked English. We had an English teacher who had graduated from Stanford. She wasn't much over 5 feet, maybe 5'2", and a knockout. She was really pretty. All the male teachers really gave her the rush. And so I didn't mind English then, but normally I didn't like English at all. My favorite subjects were math and science. I did good in those classes. When I was in high school, I took ROTC. That ROTC kept me in good stead later on when I was in the service. The school dances in high school were attended very strongly by the students. You could get a date and take a date, or you could go there stag, and there was always a bunch of girls standing up against the wall, a bunch of boys on the opposite wall, daring someone to go dance with one of the girls. The music for the dances was probably the best ever. When we went to school, it was the Glenn Miller area. It was the dance bands that were popular all over the country and all over the world. In high school, there were a couple of cute girls, but I was too shy. I wasn't so shy that I wouldn't dance at the dances, but there wasn't any favorites that I kind of dated or did anything like that with. I had played football and loved football from the time I could handle one. And we would play right out in front of our house because we had a big arc light. I'd never played with a uniform. I'd never played a hard tackle either. But we had to put these pads on, shoulder pads and kidney pads and thigh pads and so forth. And I put my uniform on, went out there. First tackle I made, I broke my collarbone. Oh, golly. That was disastrous because I wasn't able to play that year, and there's only 2 years, so the next year I didn't really have any competitive edge at all because I missed that whole year of football. I still went out and played, but I had to play on the scrub team, and we would learn the plays of the other schools that the varsity team would play, and then we would play against them during practice time, so they would be at least somewhat familiar with what the plays looked like. Because when I broke my collarbone, I went to the school nurse, and all she did was make a sling for me and told me to go to my doctor. So I had to walk from South High. They didn't send anybody with me or give me a token to ride the bus or anything. I was given the sling and told to go up there. So I had to walk up to the doctor's office. As far as I know, all he did was check the sling and set me out. In my senior year, I was living with my aunt because my dad had taken his job with the Japanese Relocation Center in Topaz, Utah, which was in central Utah. When the season was over, my dad was right there to get me, and we went to Topaz at that point in time.
Evacuation. More than 100,000 men, women, and children, all of Japanese ancestry, removed from their homes in the Pacific Coast states to wartime communities established in out-of-the-way places. Their evacuation did not imply individual disloyalty, but was ordered to reduce a military hazard at a time when danger of invasion was great. 2/3 of the evacuees are American citizens by right of birth. The rest are their Japanese-born parents and grandparents. The time, spring and summer of 1942. The place, 10 different relocation centers in unsettled parts of California, Arizona, Utah, Idaho, Wyoming, Colorado, and Arkansas. Relocation center, housing from 7,000 to 18,000 people. Barrack-type buildings divided into compartments. 12 or 14 residence buildings to a block. Each block provided with a mess hall, bathhouse, laundry building, and recreation hall. About 300 people to a block. The entire community bounded by a wire fence and guarded by military police, symbols of the military nature of the evacuation. Each family, upon arrival at a relocation center, was assigned to a single-room compartment, about 20 by 25 feet. Barren, unattractive. A stove, a light bulb, cots, mattresses, and blankets.
Dad and Mother and my sister lived in the base housing for the people that worked there, which were like military barracks, but they were a lot better than the tar paper shacks that the Japanese lived in. We at least had like a kitchen and running water and a bathroom, whereas the Japanese lived in tar paper shacks. They had community dining room, community bathroom, showers, and all that. I was very sympathetic towards them. My sister rode a school bus from Topaz into Delta to go to school. When I went there, though, I decided I didn't want to ride the school bus. So I went to school there with the Japanese. They accepted me, and I seemed to fit right in. I made a very good friend. His name was Shigeki Sugiyami. So I was in class with these Japanese. The Japanese were good students. They were conscientious. It was their um, it was the way they grew up. They revered their parents. Uh, they tried to please their parents. They were good students, and they did their best. I didn't care that much for baseball, but they did. They played a lot of baseball there. One of the Japanese was youth was put in charge of like the chemistry lab, and the humorous part is that we would go in and make up gunpowder, and then we used the machine shop that they had there for teaching the youth how to work machines, and we would roll up metal tubes and solder them and solder fins on them, and then we would stuff them with this gunpowder, and we would hide behind this shield that we made, light the fuse, and then run further away for the missile to take off, go shooting way up in the sky. Then we'd go out in the desert to try and find it. But we always crawled out under the fence and went out. It was called topaz, and there was lots of natural topaz laying out on the fields. Topaz is a hard mineral, almost as hard as diamonds, and it's a yellowish color. And we would crawl out under the fence and go out and find the topaz laying out on the desert, pick it up. I probably still have a couple of pieces of topaz. Local people were not too thrilled to have this Japanese camp there because a lot of them had sons in the service fighting the Japanese. And so they hated the Japs. I graduated high school from Topaz. When I graduated, I got my report card, and I got a notice from the state of Utah that I had graduated. I also worked at the Royal Bakery, and I was able to get a summer job at the Royal Bakery, so my dad let me go back and live with my aunt. I would have to get up for, I guess it was pretty close to 4, because it would take me maybe an hour to walk up town. Mostly what I did was clean pans, scrape the frosting off the pans when they would make their cinnamon rolls. So my dad had moved to a relocation camp in Idaho, and when I finished work for the summer, was going back to school, and went and stayed with my folks for a short time before school started. And since they were living in Idaho, I decided I'd go to the University of Idaho in Moscow, so I wouldn't have to pay an out-of-state registration fee.
You're the gem state wonder, Idaho. Tear the foe asunder, fill their cup with woe. Let 'em feel your might, pound 'em left and right. Show 'em how you fight for Idaho. You're the Vandals with the granite wall. Oh, you Vandals, hit 'em hard and let 'em fall. Fly your colors bold, silver and the gold. Make their blood run cold and they will fold for Idaho. You're the gem state.
There was a lot of commotion and excitement at the railroad station where people came into the school there. Some of the commotion was due to the fraternities. They were trying to recruit new members for their fraternity. So we went up to Spokane. We had a big pledge party.
Idaho.
Came back, I continued to live in the fraternity house where I had been sequestered and became good friends with the people in that fraternity house. The fall semester ended. I left the University of Idaho and went back to Salt Lake, where my parents were now living. And they were living in a brand new house in Sugar House area across the street from Mormon Church. And I had heard of a program in the Navy called the Captain Eddie program. If you could qualify and join the Captain Eddie program, you went in the Navy as a seaman first class. There's a seaman second class, seaman first class, so it was third step up on pay and rank. You weren't the lowest. And so my dad went with me. I just turned 17, and we went to the recruiting office in Salt Lake and said I'd like to volunteer in the Navy in the Captain Eddie program. So I signed on the dotted line. My dad signed for me. When we left the Navy recruiting office, Dad took me down to the railroad station in Salt Lake and said goodbye to Mom and Dad. My sister got on the train with my papers and went to Chicago, to the Great Lakes Naval Training Center for my boot camp. Thought that was interesting, that I guess if you're old enough to go in the military, you're old enough to look after yourself. As the train left Denver and started out into the plains, there were cornfields where the corn was as high as an elephant's eye, as the song says, and everything was so green, so different than the desert out there. I was totally shocked to see that for as far as you could see, there were these green fields with different kind of crops in them. Just so different than the desert, Salt Lake, that just blew my mind. Entered Chicago, and that was one of the best servicemen town you could ever ask for. They had USO booths everywhere, and the residents, the business people, seemed to just bend over backwards for the servicemen. They couldn't do enough for you. Everything was like gratuitous to you. It was really nice. Oh, I took my papers and went to a Navy office there, and they sent me on the local train from Chicago up to just north of Chicago, where the naval base was there.
And you're arriving with a detail of recruits at the United States Naval Training Station at Great Lakes, Illinois. Yesterday, you left your home in Farmville, Illinois, or Nashville, Tennessee, or Hopkinsville, Kentucky. You're mighty anxious to know what's ahead of you. Yesterday, you were a machinist, baker, grocer, tinsmith, cowboy, broker, painter, clerk. That was yesterday. Tomorrow you will be a sailor. Great Lakes is the most magnificent naval training establishment in the world. But more than that, Great Lakes is men, more than 70,000, eager to fight for their country and soon to get the chance. You will learn many things here, valuable on shipboard and in combat. But whatever else you may learn, one thing you will never forget: to fight and live the Navy way.
Got off the train, and they sent me to a barracks and got my uniform and put in a platoon with other new recruits, and we then went through boot camp. But boot camp was pretty rigorous. We got up early and didn't get to bed till late. We were housed in a gymnasium. Being in the ROTC, I got favored assignment there. Like in the platoon, I was the guide-on in the platoon, special duty at times. I remember one of the best duties I had was to work in this ice cream shop making milkshakes, sundaes and all that for all the guys. And they got some great milkshakes. So did I. After boot camp ended, the group I was with was being sent now to our first training. This was electronics training. We got to Gulfport, Mississippi, and each morning we would, after breakfast, we would go to a classroom there. And they were training us in basic electronics, electric circuits. We had labs as well as classroom. So I learned my basic electrical engineering there and had experience making things like make a soldering iron, put our preference in for what we wanted for advanced electronics, and I wanted aviation electronics. So I and whoever else chose that we were loaded on a train and sent to Corpus Christi, Texas. One thing that happened is that the war ended.
The war was over.
Pandemonium broke loose here 2 hours ago. Firecrackers were all over. You can hear them now, I know, across the street. I'm Kenneth Cowell from Arizona. Okay, boys. Goddamn war's over. What do you got to say about
This is the happiest day of my life.
First, the European War. And when that happened, they kind of closed the school. They weren't sure what to do with us, but they had all these students there, and there for a couple of weeks, we had free reign. So a couple of us, we hung out in the pool hall. I learned how to play pool. But then they decided, well, I will continue on with their schooling. They're not going to get out for a year or so. So I went to Corpus Christi. I found out that I could volunteer. I was the lifeguard in the officers' pool. So all I had to do was go over the officers' pool and be there as a lifeguard. One funny thing happened. The base commander was soused, really out of it. And he came over and he wanted to swim. So I had to stay right with him because he would drown if I left him. Other than that, the rest of the time I sat up in the lifeguard's chair or laid out on the deck, got a beautiful tan, hitchhiked down to this base where I could get my release from the military. So I went there, submitted my papers, and I went through the lines, the doctors, the medical, all this and that. Finally got released. And from there I went back to Corpus Christi and went into the dispatcher's office at the airport and got a ride from Corpus Christi on a B-26. I was riding in the nose, laying flat on my belly as we flew over the country out to the base that we landed at in San Francisco. So that was a good share of the distance from where I was to my home. And then I hitchhiked and rode a bus from there to Salt Lake. And the night I got home, my uncle, who had been released from the service earlier, was there and met me, and we went to the dollhouse. And that's where Rusty was a car hop, and she was, I think, the only car hop there. So she would bring the trays out and take your order, go in and mix up the milkshakes, and bring the sundaes and the banana splits out. He said, "You got to meet this redhead." So that's how I met Rusty. She brought the milkshake to me. You could tell she was feisty. She was just like her hair advertised. But I thought she was interesting enough to follow up on. She was very personable, and she gave them the best milkshakes they could ever get. So that was a huge plus. Lagoon is a recreational park that has rides. It has a Ferris wheel, has a roller coaster. It has food booths. It's just a fun place to go, north of Salt Lake. My family was at a picnic table where they brought a nice picnic lunch. Somehow or other, saw Rusty there. She monopolized my time. She asked me to teach her how to swim. And I later learned that the reason for this is that she wanted to turn me around so that I couldn't see her girlfriends that were on the diving board. And I wasn't a very good teacher because she still doesn't know how to swim. I don't think she really wanted to learn how to swim. She just wanted to occupy my time. But she got the worst of it because she just about drowned. I started going out with Rusty. It was fun going to her house to get her because they had a player piano. I remember I bought a couple of rolls to play on the piano to kind of woo her. But it was fun to put them on the player piano and pump the piano with your feet as it played the music. Would take her to movies up in Salt Lake. I asked her if we could go steady. And she says, well, not right now. She said, I've got some other commitments that I've got to fulfill first. I promised a boy I'd go on a date with him and we would go someplace. She had 4 or 5 commitments that she said she had to fulfill before she could go steady with me. So until that occurred, I would contact her about getting together by using one of those player rolls. I bought one and sat down at the piano and I put it on and played it. It was, gee. It was, in effect, a proposal to go steady. And she finally admitted that all of her commitments were satisfied and she could go steady. I'd be there at the house as soon as I could get there and stay there until I'd have to walk home, and it would be late at night, walking down all these streets. So we had made arrangements with the bishop to get our endowments, and we went to the temple and got our endowments, and the next day was our wedding day. My mother had fixed a wedding breakfast, so we had all the goodies at like a brunch. We went to Memory Grove, and that's where the reception was being held, in Memory Grove. And we had a dance, and we had cake and hors d'oeuvres and other things there for all the guests. I started my schooling at the University of Utah, and we were married at the time and lived in student housing. We did not have any children, so we had just a single unit. It was a one-room affair with kitchen, bathroom, living room, all in one. When we had our first child, which was Peggy, then we got to go to a larger unit that had 2 rooms. Essentially nothing but the money coming in from the GI Bill, which was something like $35 a month. Wasn't much. Good thing both my parents and Rusty's parents lived close by, so that we could get food from them on occasion. We had our first child. It's Peggy Ann. She was a very attractive little girl. Wherever we'd take her, why, we'd have a lot of people oohing and ahhing about her. She was like a little Shirley Temple. Rusty did try to help me in school by reading my textbooks, and when another student and I would be studying, and she would say, "Oh, that's on page so-and-so, right there." And certainly that was it. She was lucky and hit the page that we were studying, and made it look like she really was smart. I got my bachelor's degree in engineering in 3 years instead of 4, partly because the classes that I took when I was in the Navy, they gave me college credit for. Essentially, as soon as I graduated in June with my degree, we packed up and headed for California. Found living accommodations in a garage apartment across the street from Douglas Aircraft. I worked in like a hangar, and it was how big hangars can be. It was a large open space with all these drafting boards, and there were hundreds of engineers there. I was sharp enough that I kind of blew the mind of the instructor. He thought I was a genius. And so I benefited greatly by outsmarting him, because I got good reviews and got good assignments, and started making a little more money. We got a small house in that neighborhood. It was nice from the standpoint that we were by ourselves, had a little yard for children, but it was horror for Rusty, and there were cockroaches. Lived in the house with us. You'd hear them at night. Turn the lights on, you'd see them scamper away. Rusty got a job at Northrop, working in the shop. She had all kinds of tricks played on her because she didn't know nothing about anything. They'd have her running all over that plant looking for left-handed monkey wrenches and things like that. Because of Peggy, she worked like the swing shift. When I'd come home from work, why then she would go to work. Rusty liked the beach. I liked the beach. Peggy wasn't sure whether she liked the beach or not. She was a little fearful of the water. So she would play right at the edge of the water. We moved into housing development. It wasn't subsidized, but you had to meet certain requirements to be able to get into it. And the housing was the kind of housing that I lived in with my parents when we were in the relocation camp. So when they dismantled the relocation camp, they moved them up onto that property.
Okay.
Consultant for quite a number of companies. And he would have people like me take a battery of tests, and then he would evaluate the individual based on those tests and would make recommendations to companies to hire them. I scored high on the tests, like a genius level on the tests. So he had recommended me to Everson Jennings to head up their engineering department, which is what I did. Everson Jennings was a premier company in the world for wheelchairs. So I could walk to work for them as well.
But there was worse to come. A highly trained and well-equipped North Korean army swarmed across the 38th parallel to attack unprepared South Korean defenders. Caught off guard, they were all but overwhelmed until the United Nations took its historic vote to intervene. While the Korean Republicans fought a desperate delaying action, a United Nations police force with General Douglas MacArthur as...
The Korean War started. Since while I was getting my degree at the University of Utah, I attended ROTC and got a reserve commission in the Air Force. So when the Korean War started, I was called into the Air Force because I had the commission, and I applied for pilot training because I'd always wanted to become a pilot. And I was assigned to pilot school in Hondo, Texas. So we moved to San Antonio. All of us who were in the pilot training lived in San Antonio in military barracks there. And we would carpool out to Hondo to go to class. I had like a perfect score in all the ground school, all the classwork that I took. But when I would take pilot training, we were flying AT-6s, which are open cockpit. And the worst time I would have was when we would be coming in to land and we would throttle back and idle the mixture, and the fumes would come into the cockpit and I would lose my lunch. So they put up with me for a couple of weeks. The pilots would take me up and do all kinds of acrobatics and so forth. That never fazed me at all. But then they'd come in for a landing, change that mixture, and it would put fumes in the cockpit, and I'd just throw up. I had to carry a paper bag with a plastic bag in it every time I flew. So I finally got washed out of pilot training and got sent back to Baltimore, Maryland, to a new command in the Air Force called Air Research and Development Command. And there was, I think, 2 other second lieutenants that served in that headquarters, and there were dozens of generals and major officers, colonels, and so forth there. And I served there until the Korean War ended and I got a release from the Air Force. I learned of a scholarship program at Hughes and I applied for it and got awarded that, which meant that I worked full-time at Hughes, and they paid for education at UCLA, paid for my tuition and books and so forth. We were living on the campus at UCLA while I was going to school there and working at Hughes, and went to Westwood Ward, which included the Beverly Hills, Bel Air areas of people. So there were very well-to-do people there, and they treated us students very, very warmly, and couldn't do enough for us. Schooling was to the point where I'd taken the classwork, but I now needed to write a thesis in order to get a master's degree. So I started working on a thesis, and the work became full-time, and I just lost interest in trying to write a thesis. Took the easy way out. That is, I worked, earned good money, and didn't bother with any more schooling. I went back to Douglas because I was no longer on a Hughes scholarship at UCLA. I applied at Douglas and they accepted me, and I preferred that work to what I was doing at Hughes. We were able to rent a house in Westwood and moved out of the student housing. And this house was right across the street from the Los Angeles Temple when it was being built. So across our street was the temple grounds. Peggy went to kindergarten, first grade, so forth at school there in Westwood. She was in the first grade when Jackie was born. When she would wake up and want her bottle, there wasn't much fussing. It was almost immediately she would scream her head off. And I'd bound out of bed to go get the bottle and heat it up so she could have it. And one time the door from our bedroom to the room she was in wasn't fully open or closed. It was part way. And I wasn't wide enough awake, and I ran right into that door. And Jackie was growing, and she was very outgoing. She knew all the neighbors. Gary was born 2 years later. Jackie spent a lot of time over at the temple grounds, and they could see these coins in the fountain. And so Gary was dumb enough to let Jackie hold his feet while he ducked his head under the water. Trusted her to pull him up when he would grab these coins, and then I guess they would dry off, or Gary would dry off, and they'd walk down to the liquor store that was a block away from the temple grounds and buy their goodies with the money that they would get out of that fountain.
A mighty roar. Our rocket vibrates. White hot flame gushes downward, and the great beast lifts slowly from the earth. We are about to create a new planet that we will call Sputnik. It is small, this first satellite, but after it, we will launch others. In the olden days, explorers like Vasco da Gama and Columbus had the good fortune to open up the terrestrial globe. Now we have the good fortune to open up space, and it is for those in the future to envy us our joy.
When the rocket reached a speed of 18,000 miles an hour, its flame went out, and in the silence of space, it joined the moon in orbit around the Earth. Then its casing opened, the springs snapped, and the nose cone was pushed out of the way. A ball with 4 antennae emerged to go it alone in the darkness of space. And a radio began to send a signal back to Earth. Humanity had entered the space age.
The missile program got started there because of Sputnik. And so Douglas wanted to get going in missiles, and I got assigned to head up the missiles program at Douglas. And a missile division at Douglas. But I guess the nickname would have been Nike division because the main product was the Nike anti-aircraft missile.
During the last few years, the Army has been engaged in developing a new member of the Nike family, the Nike Zeus. Its mission is the destruction of enemy ballistic missiles which pose a threat to the continental United States. Recognizing the requirement early for an anti-missile missile system, the Army got started on actual development of the system in 1957. Today, Nike Zeus is the free world's only anti-ICBM missile system under development. In developing the Nike Zeus program, what was visualized as being required was a complex of sophisticated radars tied to anti-missile missiles. Since human reaction time is too slow, an extensive computer complex would be required to control the entire system. The acquisition radar would detect one or more targets simultaneously. The discrimination radar would distinguish warheads from decoys. The target track radar would provide precise trajectory information to the computers. The missile track radar would guide the missile to the intercept point. The target intercept computer would collect all information, make decisions, launch missiles, and direct them to the target. The acquisition radar used in current tests is a significant advance in radar development. Its tremendous power reaches targets hundreds of miles away. The discrimination radar is being developed to solve the complex problem of distinguishing between decoys and warheads. The target track radar is also specially developed for Nike Zeus. Numerous Nike Zeus test firings have been carried out successfully. To visualize system operation, imagine that minutes ago, an enemy ICBM left a launching pad thousands of miles away. It possesses the destructive power to wipe out an entire city, and it is only hundreds of miles from its destination. The Zeus acquisition radar would sight it. In a matter of seconds, the presence of a target would be confirmed. The target tracking radar would lock on. Information pouring into the computer would then determine when to launch the missile. When the enemy warhead is within range, the computer would fire Zeus automatically. The missile track radar would guide the missile. At the proper moment, the Zeus warhead would be detonated. The threat posed by the enemy warhead would be destroyed by Nike Zeus at a safe distance above the Earth. Nike Zeus has passed all tests to date. In the very near future, its capability will be tested at Kwajalein Island against targets launched by ICBM boosters from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. Realizing the importance of this anti-missile system to the protection of the free world, the Army is pursuing the development of Nike Zeus on a high priority basis.
The Nike missile was an interesting assignment because I would be assigned to go out to the Kwajalein Islands in the South Pacific, where we would launch the Nike missiles against intercontinental ballistic missiles that were fired from Vandenberg Air Force Base. And we would intercept them out there over the South Pacific. It's like firing a small bullet, a little larger bullet. And then the Spartan was brought along because the radar guidance systems continued to be improved. Got an opportunity to sell the house on Selby and purchase the house behind us on Malcolm. Some friends of ours that lived in that Westwood ward lived up in the Westwood Hills, and they had some farm animals. And they had to go someplace, and they asked Rusty if she would watch this goat for a couple of days while they were gone. So she didn't know anything about goats. So she agreed. Whatever this tree was in our backyard, I think it was an avocado tree. Goats can eat most anything, but an avocado leaf was something that they couldn't eat. So if it ate an avocado leaf, it was going to die. So we couldn't let the goat out into the backyard. So we had to keep it penned up in the kitchen and close the door so that it couldn't get out of the kitchen. But boy, when we got up in the morning, those goats are agile and they can jump. And it could jump from the floor up to the rim of the sink and land on it and stay there. It didn't have to land on a big flat surface. Those goats could maneuver on thin ledges. And it pottied. It was like a rabbit. It continued to potty. It dropped droppings all over. What a mess we had there. There were 3 other couples that agreed to put some money into a financial effort to build a house in the Hollywood Hills and sell it. We got to the point where the house was designed and built. Rusty and I agreed we would buy them out and go ahead and sell the place, and whenever we could, we would get the profits from it. We actually moved into that spec house in Hollywood until we could get it sold. There was a dog that lived in those hills. It was like a collie, I think. And it seemed to round up all the dogs in the Hollywood Hills where we were. And with a pack of dogs, and he would go around. But he became infatuated with Gary. Gary was his friend. And Gary went to the hospital. When Gary came home from the hospital, the dog just forced its way into our house, laid on Gary's bed, and we couldn't move him. The people that owned the dog, we talked to them, told them what was happening, and that was okay with them if the dog stayed there. So the dog stayed there till Gary was feeling well enough to get up. And then the dog would go on his way, go round up all his other dogs and take wherever they had to go. There was a couple that lived a couple of doors away from us in the Hollywood Hills. He started up gymnasiums. He liked our house, but he was so tied up in his gyms. But he liked our house, and he said he would like to buy it. And Rusty and I said, we can't sell this house to him. He's got a couple of kids. He can't afford it. But he came to us over a period of maybe a month, 2 or 3 times, asking to buy it. He really liked that house. We finally just gave up and said, yeah, we'll sell the house to you. I don't remember what the amount was, but we sold it to him. Once we did, we moved to Reseda in the San Fernando Valley. I had to commute from Reseda into Santa Monica because I was working at Douglas. We purchased a VW convertible from Rusty's brother Ron. Why, I don't know. But that's what I drove from Reseda to Santa Monica every day, to up and down the mountains, because I had to go over the Santa Monica Mountains to get there. Wendy was maybe 2 or 3 when we lived there. And I remember she fell in the pool. It was near the deep end. And she was looking up at me through the water. And I had to jump in there and get her out. She wasn't at all bothered. She was just looking at, oh, it's interesting. Oh, what a frightening experience that was, to push her out of the pool and make sure she was breathing. It came about that we bought the house in Canoga Park because I worked with a man at Douglas. He thought it was a nice area and that the houses were a good buy. Rusty agreed that they were a pretty good deal. Rusty was teaching oil painting. She was doing it in the house, and she didn't like to have her house messed up. I suggested we have our bishop, who was a carpenter, build a guest house on the back of the property that she could use as a studio, which he did. And that worked out very good for her. We had a pool, so the yard was fenced in the back. The people could come through a gate at the side of the yard, come across by the pool and into the studio that she had there. Well, we had a palm tree in Reseda, and I thought it would be a simple deal to transplant that palm tree. So I dug around it and it has a very large root ball. So it was a very large hole that I dug. And I thought it was probably not going to be that heavy. Gary's little red wagon down underneath it, and then I took out the supports, and the little red wagon was crushed. Then I had to get that palm tree from the Reseda house over to one in Canoga Park. Is that I went and rented a forklift and picked it up out of the hole in Reseda, transported it out to the flat trailer, and set it on the flat trailer out to where I was going to plant it in front of the guest house back there. Miraculously, it got planted there. The commute from the house in Canoga Park to McDonnell Douglas in Santa Monica was a fairly long trip, probably a total of 3 hours, hour and a half each way. When our kids were growing up, we generally took vacations one place. We had a VW bus, took the kids to Salt Lake so they could see their grandparents on my side and Rusty's side. I think we learned later on that neither parents were overjoyed to see their grandkids because they were old people and didn't have the patience to put up with kids. There was a layoff at Douglas. The only income we had was from Rusty's painting lessons, but I've been out of work for probably well over a year. A good part of that time, I essentially lived in our motorhome as I tried to sell the artwork of Rusty and our daughter Peggy. They were artists. I was able to get a couple of jobs doing some remodeling, and I used the RV to do that. Sometimes I would just sleep in the RV at night, stay there for a few days until I got the remodeling done. It was shortly after Gary returned home from his mission that he went with me. We had some trouble getting the RV to start. And the engine in the RV was actually in the RV, and it was between the driver's seat and the passenger seat. There was a cowling there that covered the engine, and you would remove the cowling to work on the engine. We were working on the engine, and we were trying to get it started. Primed the carburetor with some raw gas to get it started, and it backfired, and Gary was standing over it, so it blew all these hot burning gases up into his face, and he was on fire. It burned very quickly, burned down to the steel frame. Nothing was there but the steel frame. And Gary was hospitalized in the burn center. The experience of Gary being on fire was phenomenal. He was in excruciating pain. So that was a very scary experience. I think it was in that period of time that Rusty's student, whose father worked at Northrop, made arrangements for me to go in for an interview. And I was able to get a job at Northrop. So I went to work for Northrop, and I was working on a super secret program. That always irritated Rusty because she liked to know what I was doing, and all I could say, it's secret and I can't tell you anything about it. Her students would ask her what I did, and she kept saying, he can't tell me, it's secret. Finally, she got tired of it, and she said, oh, he's a sex therapist. You can't imagine the looks I got when I would go into her art class to say hello to her and to her students. And then at the end of that period, they had a big celebration at Northrop. And they had the rollout of the B-2. And that was the first time that it became public what the B-2 looked like. And all the super secrecy of it was, shouldn't say all, but it was no longer a super secret project.
With the B-2 in the background, Tom Jones paid tribute to the many members of the B-2 team.
When I look at that airplane, I can't help but think of one thing. The years and years of sheer hard work by so many men and women here at Northrop and our team members all over the country. And for years, they've been working in a kind of honorable exile. They haven't been able to tell anyone what they've been doing. They haven't been able to talk about their problems and their frustrations. And even more important, they haven't been able to talk about their successes.
Secrecy still remained on how it was so stealthy that radar couldn't pick it up. It was a huge airplane. It was about 300 feet wingspan. But the interesting thing that few people realized is that the thickness of the wing at its center, where the cockpit was up on top of it, the big body is where they carried the bombs, but that fuselage was about 32 feet high. So when the doors were closed and you were in there and looked up, it was over 30 feet to the top of that cavity. I became specialized there in auxiliary power units, which are really just small engines. They are used to either start the engines, the main engines, or if the airplane is at a remote base where they don't have all the ground carts they need, then they can start up the auxiliary power unit, and it will drive the electrical generators on the airplane and the air conditioning units and start the engines, so they can pretty much do all their maintenance and whatever they need to do at a remote base with the auxiliary power unit. The retirement was a huge bonanza for me. Northrop needed to cut their overhead. Best to do was to cut the older employees that were making the most money and keep the younger, newer ones. So to entice we old fogies to retire, they gave us bonuses if we would agree to retire. Your retirement was based on how much money you made, and fortunately for me, just before I retired, I was putting in a lot of overtime, so I was making a good salary. Probably I finally made $1 million a year in salary before I retired. I think I may have worked a total of 12 years for them. You say 15, maybe it was 15. But when I retired, I was credited with like 22 or 23 years of service. So that when you took what the pay was that you would get for 1 year of service and multiply it by 23, that made it a fairly tidy sum. And there were other benefits which would increase the amount of pay for retiring. So when I retired, I did nothing. We sold our dream house in Marietta. It's the one my wife really fell in love with. And we bought a motorhome. A fifth wheel. We had a truck to pull the fifth wheel with. Had used the fifth wheel to go back east to pick up our daughter Jackie, who was completing her mission in the Macon, Georgia mission. And so we drove their motor home back there and picked her up and brought her home. And we took advantage of going on that trip went to all the Mormon sites back east. The scenic things that we saw, going back to the Hill Cumorah and Palmyra and Kirtland. We stopped at every church site from the East Coast till we got out here. We visited the mission headquarters there, but they took us on a tour and gave us a good sales pitch to go on a mission. I guess it appealed to them since we were living in an RV that we could serve a mission in Cold Fort, Utah. But since we had the RV and they had an RV park there, they suggested that we consider that. So we asked them, when could we report? So we served from March to September. And the funny thing about it is in March, when we reported at Cold Fort, we reported in a snowstorm. And when we were released and left in September, we left in a snowstorm. So we really just made it between the winter weather to serve a mission there in Cold Fort. The reason that serving the mission in Cold Fort was so excruciating for Rusty is that we would sit on these benches, and when the people would stop their cars and come over, then we missionaries would then take them on a tour of the fort. But many of the times we'd be sitting on these benches and there would be a snake come down a tree, come along the ground. We had a crew that their job was to pick up these snakes. Some of them were rattlesnakes, some of them were blow snakes. But their job was to pick up these snakes and put them in a trash can. And then at the end of the day, after the traffic had subsided, then we'd put the trash cans in the back of a pickup truck and drive out in the desert for a few miles and then dump the snakes out in the desert. I was disappointed that I didn't get to go on a full-time mission when I was 17, 18 years old. Because at that time, the war was on. I was in the Navy. When I got out of the Navy, there were the 17 and 18-year-olds, and I was then in my 20s. So they would get the preference for the missions. And then I was married. That was another obstacle to going on a mission. We were able to serve a mission at Cold Fort, but as far as me serving a mission, no way, since I was married. Came back to California, and we would go from campground to campground because of the 2-week limitation. And then Rusty realized that it wasn't easy, particularly on me, but it also fell on her to pull up everything, pull in all the slide outs and pick up all the things that you have scattered around your campsite, put them away, and hook up and haul off to another spot. So she realized that we needed to change our lifestyle. And so she started looking for a place that we could rent or buy. And she found this one, and at first thought it was too big, and she didn't particularly like the layout of it. But she came back a couple of times, and after seeing others, she realized that this one met most of the needs that she wanted fulfilled in having a place to stay. So we put a down payment on it. First chance we got to get a fair sum of money, we paid it off so that we don't have any house payments. I had worked for some period of time in the Family History Center, going in every Wednesday and working 4 hours there. And I continued that until just recently. Rusty has been my wife for 66 years. It's been a long time. I hardly know life without her because she's been a part of my life for so long. She's a genius in many ways. Her heart's really big. It's amazing she's able to keep it within her body because she loves everybody. She has great compassion for people.
Crying on the inside, 'cause I'm still in love with you.
First thing I would want to say is that I know that Jesus Christ is our Savior, that our Father lives in heaven. He is literally our spiritual Father, and that I'm so grateful that I have this testimony that this is true, that I believe it with all my heart. It's the foundation of my life because it gives me a solid foundation to build my life on, knowing where I came from, that I came from living with my Father in heaven. And in order to become like him, I had to get a body. So I had Christ make this earth for us so that we could get a body. And Christ performed the atonement so that we could overcome our sins to return with our Father in heaven and live with him eternally. I'm so grateful that I was married for time and eternity in the temple before we had any children, so that they are all born under the covenant, that they'll be our children for the eternities. I'm grateful that I was raised in the church, even though my parents were not active continuously, but off and on. My father's mother, my grandmother, was the solid foundation that I built on for my testimony in the church. She was faithful through to the end. I'm grateful that we have such fine children, but it's also great that we have our children as close as we do, that we're able to spend time with them and with our grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Life has truly been great for us. We're blessed. I had a good job. I made good money. We were always able to provide for our children. We're still able to provide when they have special needs, need some help. I'm glad that we can. It's been a whole day that I've been able to sit here in front of this camera and be illuminated with all these lights so that it'll record on the film and that you're recording the sound to go with it so that others in our family will be able to see and hear this sometime. I think it's beyond measurable value to be able to communicate with family, some that I'll never see, some that will see me once maybe, or hear me once. It's a rare opportunity that few people have, because what you're doing is very unique. I don't think you can name another person that's doing anything similar to this. It's that unique. And in the kind of a world we live in where it's very commercial and fast living, for there to be something that members of a family can rally around and hold on to, I think is very important. And I think a lot of family members will see the importance of this.